as I think about epics, that's how I would define them in a sense. It's not just that they're this big visually appealing story on screen with all of these characters, but also that there is something deep that resonates with me.
Hello, and welcome to the Cup of Tea Critiques podcast. I'm your host, Brandon Chasen, and like always, I'll be joined today by the team that brings you cupofteacritiques.com. Here we'll dive deep into the productions and topics we broach on our website, so you can decide for yourself if they're your cup of tea. Ready for a deep look with the deep brew? This week's topic, what makes for an epic production? Cup of Tea Critiques is a family affair, and I'm here with my brother Chris, my mother Reva, and my father Terry. Chris and I were talking, and I was sharing with him that, I think a good topic for us would be to go over epics. And it's not just the literal definition of what an epic movie is, but is it more personal? Because we can easily call a few movies like Ben-Hur or Lord of the Rings. It's very easy to see those that fall under the epic category. But what exactly should constitute an epic? And is it just about an entirety of a production, or can it be just a singular moment that really makes it stand out? So I wanted to kind of take the opportunity for us to discuss those things and just get everybody's opinion on them.
Yeah, I'm all over the place on that one because I can go either way with that. I can think of, long, huge productions that are epic, or considered epic. I can also come up with movies that aren't necessarily in that category, but to your point, there's a moment in it that's an epic moment that pretty much makes you deem the movie epic. So, yeah. And one of a couple of things that I found interesting in some of the materials that we were reading on the subject was bringing up things like animated works. I hadn't thought about that. I was along the lines of what you said, Ben-Hur, Ten Commandments, that kind of stuff. But they brought up a couple of animated shows Toy Story, The Lion King. It's okay. And then the other was TV series. I never thought about that. Game of Thrones was one thing that was mentioned. It's okay, yeah, I guess I could see where I would probably label that. But yeah, I have a whole list of movies that I feel fall into that category.
We did our talk about adventure movies and how there aren't quite the same amount of adventure movies like The Mummy like there used to be. And I feel even though, as they said, the epic can fall into a lot of different genres, I feel like at the core, it's an adventure. It's a prolonged, very expanded, usually timepiece kind of adventure. And so those are the movies I think about. And my first thought is that I think my first inclination is just to say epics are generally kind of boring for me. But I think maybe that's because I'm including the time element or my first thought is generally either biblical adaptations or Greek mythological adaptations. Those are the two that first spring to mind. And I think the idea of going to the movies and sitting down for 3.5 hours to watch something like that is just a little much for me. If it came on, Turner Classic Movies or something, I think I'd be more inclined to watch it. But that's generally what I think. It's interesting. It feels like and epics aren't, that common anymore. And so I think maybe it's kind of along the lines of what we were saying about adventure movies. But, but it is interesting. They're usually adaptations where they exist in kind of the sci-fi world the way Dune does, but a lot of times they come from some other kind of source material. So, but I'm generally not the biggest fan of them, I would say.
Yeah, it really depends. Like you said, as far as adventure movies, I can kind of get into those a little more. I never was one for the Indiana Jones set of movies. Some people, they love it because it's the whole adventure thing and consider it an epic and a classic. The Mummy that you mentioned is more along the lines of one that I enjoyed more. I would say is an epic one. But it's interesting that they kind of, over time, they're the older, quote unquote, epic movies, like what we mentioned, Ben-Hur and the Ten Commandments. Another thing that I saw mentioned was Lawrence of Arabia, which is another long drawn out type of movie. One that I saw when I was a kid that if you go back and you look at it, I mean, the graphics are horrible, but I guess for the time they did the best they could with that kind of stuff. Jason and the Argonauts. I don't know if you've ever seen that, but that's a very old kind of along those same lines of the Lawrence of Arabia and Ben-Hur type movies. But the gargoyles and things like that were really mechanical looking and whatnot. But it was a fun movie. I was a kid, hey.
No, I was just thinking that typically when I thought about an epic, I thought about it being, to Chris's point, a long journey, a long story. And I've also thought about it in terms of its visual appeal. As I read through some of these articles, I realize that is just one element of it, and I'm not so sure if it's just a smaller element of it if I had to cut epic into, several pieces. One article, for example, said it should speak to grander themes of humanity. And I love that. I love that phrasing. It should be thought-provoking. It should resonate with us in some grand way. As I think about epics, that's how I would define them in a sense. It's not just that they're this big visually appealing story on screen with all of these characters, but also that there is something deep that resonates with me, that is, inspiring and kind of giving me some sense of direction in my life. That to me is epic.
So I know when I picked this topic out, I was talking with Chris, and one of the things that was interesting for me doing the research for this was, like you, Dad, one of the YouTube videos we watched mentioned a lot of those old granular-looking productions, the Ben-Hur, Ten Commandments, Lawrence of Arabia. And I mentioned that because growing up, I remember hearing the term epic and realizing that it was something meant to literally take my life away, because they were ridiculously long, ridiculously dry, and ridiculously boring for any 8-year-old to have to sit through. A perfect example is the Ten Commandments. It is a very good production. I'm not taking anything away from the Ten Commandments, and older Brandon can appreciate it much better than 8-year-old Brandon that could not get that 4 to 5 hours of his life back. But that being said, when I brought this topic up with Chris, I'm much more, well, I won't say much more mature. I'm supposedly more mature than I was at the time I watched the Ten Commandments. And so Chris said something very interesting, because what I think of with epics can be summed up in one quote from The Hobbit. There's a scene where he's running, Bilbo's running off, and they're asking him, where's he going? And he yells, I'm going on an adventure. And that to me is what really starts the idea that something can be an epic. And so that's where now my brain goes to. When I think of what is an epic production, I think of something that has taken me on some sort of adventure. And I'll also admit this too, along those lines, and one of the reasons why the Lord of the Rings trilogy, The Hobbit and that whole storyline altogether, one thing they did a really good job of was, unlike the Ten Commandments, there's some action to keep the viewer engaged throughout the production. They progress the story all the way through, but there's more moments than just a bunch of talking and stern faces and dry boringness as there was in the Ten Commandments. I'm sorry, I got to say it is true. But, The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, they have fight scenes, chase scenes. There's obvious dialogue you need to listen to throughout, and that's why I view those especially as an epic.
Yeah. I think a little bit touching on what your mother said is a lot of it for me is how it makes you feel. It's not only the visual, but it's also the feel that you get from movies. I would toss in things like 2 movies that I don't know if people would call them epic, but there might be moments in it, like you said earlier, that you point to that say, okay, it's an epic moment, and that makes the movie epic. Field of Dreams. It's the feel of that entire movie that, going from the journey, so to speak, of Field of Dreams, and Ferris Bueller's Day Off. I think that to me is another one that, It's not. I guess in some sense it is sort of an adventure, but yeah, those two in particular kind of stand out to me in that.
That's interesting because I was after Brandon brought this topic up, I was thinking, and obviously it's subjective in a sense, right? Like, it's the same as like what makes a movie a classic or what makes an album a classic.
Yeah.
It's kind of like it's a little subjective, but I was wondering if based on some of the other criteria that people will throw out in video essays and such, it feels like part of what makes a movie an epic is the setting being kind of, the desert, space, the flatlands, kind of like just this kind of spread out, low population density kind of setting where that looks, good in a wide frame essentially, and then you say Ferris Bueller, which takes place in Chicago.
Yeah.
So it's yeah, I guess because it is also is a comedy, which one of the video essays we watched said comedies were the one genre they didn't think epics could fit into. And so I think it's interesting you throw out Ferris Bueller, because I feel like what this boils down to, and what I was thinking about, is that epics. There's no category, there's no award category for epics or anything like that. So the definition of it, I think, not only is subjective, but kind of not really hinging on anything. So I think of epics as a way to describe a movie to somebody who hasn't seen it, kind of. So it's funny to say Ferris Bueller being an epic, I think, is interesting because it's like, if somebody had never heard of Ferris Bueller and you said, it's this epic about a kid, ditching school with his friends, I think they'd go, wait a minute, So there is that. So I don't even know if I'm pushing back because I also like that film, but it does make me think what does that limitation make certain things that you would think of as epics not epics?
I don't trust this kid any further than I can throw him.
Well, with your bad knee, Ed, you shouldn't throw anybody. It's true.
What is so dangerous about a character like Ferris Bueller is he gives good kids bad ideas.
Uh-huh.
Last thing I need at this point in my career is 1,500 Ferris Bueller disciples running around these halls. He jeopardizes my ability to effectively govern this student body.
Well, makes you look like an ass is what he does, Ed.
I'll push back. I don't think Ferris Bueller qualifies as an epic. As I listened to these video essays and read through these articles and did some thinking about how I have thought about epics over the years, I began to synthesize this material, and there are some things that really stuck out to me. One of the things that really stuck out is the statement that, an epic contains unique worlds we can only enter through the story itself. You think about Dune, for example. That's a world you can only enter through that story. You think about The Godfather, parts 1 and 2, which they described as an epic. What's the likelihood you're going to be able to enter that world other than through that story? That's certainly not the case with, say, a Ferris Bueller. And so The Lord of the Rings, that's another one that I would define as an epic. So worlds we can only enter through that story.
Sneaky little hobbitses. Wicked, tricksy, false. No. Master? Yes, precious, false. They will cheat you, hurt you, lie. Master's my friend. You don't have any friends. Nobody likes you. Not listening. You're a liar. And a thief. No. Murderer.
So there is a uniqueness, I think, a distinctiveness even of epics. So yeah, I would push back on something like Ferris Bueller, and I tend to agree. Maybe Chris, you're right. Maybe even in terms of comedy itself, they talked about the time to. The reason these movies are long, Brandon, you mentioned how Ten Commandments is long, and along with a bunch of other epics, they do tend to be long. As a matter of fact, I think one video said they average about 2 hours 40. They should be, I think he said, about 2 hours 40 minutes, but they average close to 3 hours, if not more. And what was said in this particular video essay is that time is needed so they can, one, build the world, and to build the time needed for us to care about the characters in that world. And it's not something they can do in 30 minutes, 60 minutes, 90 minutes, 120 minutes. It takes time to do that. And so epics are slow moving films for that reason. And Chris mentioned, we don't see a whole lot of epics anymore. And that's probably one of the reasons why. They are films that require an awful lot of resources, a lot of time, a lot of actors, these extravagant sets. I'm going beyond what I wanted to focus on initially, but I think their epics are distinct from other films.
Yeah,
I'm with Brandon on the Ten Commandments, though. Come on,
thank you, bro.
4 hours. I remember as a kid being like, "There's only 10 of them. How much time do you need?"
You ain't wrong, bro. I mean, I swear, Chris and I, we'd watched the Ten Commandments, and I feel like, bro, you may have been 5 or 6 years old when the movie started, and it ended when you were about 7 or 8. Like the Ten Commandments lasted forever.
God has set before you this day his laws of life and good and death and evil. Those who will not live by the law shall die by the law.
Well, let me push back on that as well, on both of you on that.
You don't think it lasted forever?
I'm not saying it didn't last a long time.
You had a teenager when it started, and by the time you were done, I was able to drink.
I went to see that movie when I was about, maybe I was about 10, 11 years old when I went to see that movie at the show. And I was someone who went to church every Sunday, but not on my own volition. My parents forced me. So I'll admit that.
I wasn't going to put you on blast.
But I was, well versed in Bible stories, and that particular Bible story I was well versed in. And so the idea of, God opening up the Red Sea, I just had to see that. That was just spectacular. And so I had absolutely no problem sitting through any of that film. That's not to say that I necessarily paid attention to all of the dialogue and a lot of the things that came before the waters were parted. But I tell you, that movie is worth sitting through just for that part, if nothing else. So yeah. That's how I feel about it.
I know this.
Y'all are heathens. Y'all heathens.
Yes, guilty. I will also say this, and I know this sounds crazy. For somebody that is absolutely hating on how long this movie is, I will also state this, because you brought up a very interesting point. We were talking about epic moments in a production. And the parting of the Red Sea, the fact that it collapses on, his men,
from the army,
it's an epic moment that, with today's cinematography, with the way we can do special effects and everything like that, maybe a remake that isn't so dang granular, less dust on it, maybe I would be more inclined to check that out and be interested. It's partially for cinematic effect, but also I think that even for my own generation, I might feel the story even more now than I did back then if there's an updated version. Otherwise, the only thing I take away from that is, so it is written, so it shall be done. And that's it.
It's not just, we don't have to belabor this. We don't have to belabor this, but it's not just an epic moment, but it's it allows you to appreciate the power of God, and we can
Agreed.
put this out if we have to. And so I talked about it's the emotional response to these films, epic films. That is what they do. That is what they do, and that is what I think was so great about the Ten Commandments. So I'm sorry I interrupted, Chris. I apologize.
I was gonna say and I know we're circling back around, but I was gonna say, with comedies, an interesting thing I think is comedies kind of can subvert the idea of an epic. They can use that to their advantage because there are these kind of mini adventures in comedies that can sometimes get played up like an epic. So it's kind of I think it's a genre that can kind of, even though I wouldn't call the very many or really any comedies epics. They do take elements of that genre to themselves, kind of like you mentioned Ferris Bueller. And the one thing I was gonna pitch is kind of an absurd thing is Harold and Kumar Go to White Castle an epic? That's an adventure unto itself as well. But I think they get a lot of comedy out of just playing. I think generally the stakes in comedies are too low for them to fall into that category. But I think, they get a lot of humor out of playing it up that way. And there's also the element to try to push our conversation forward. There was the idea of good and evil being very clearly laid out in a lot of epics.
That's true.
That's true. Yeah. Comedies sometimes, flip that on its head, where the main character is actually in the wrong, technically. Mm-hmm. And the villain is, if you look at Ferris Bueller, he's cutting class. He's ditching school, and he's pulling his friends out of school with him. And the principal, who was, granted he was a jerk, but he's trying to get kids to go to school. So ultimately, it's kind of flipping the idea on its head. We're cheering for the kid that's actually not really doing the right thing. And that happens in a lot of comedy. Animal House is kind of the same way. That happens in a lot of comedies. So I do think, even though I wouldn't throw comedies in with epics, they do play off of that genre.
Okay, I have multiple points on this that I think I'm curious to hear your rebuttal to this, Chris. But going back, Dad, I have to agree with Mom. I'm going to push back on the idea that Ferris Bueller is an epic, in part because of two lines that are here in one of our articles. It states that an epic is, number one, longer than the average story. Ferris Bueller is not. And the other says it is wide in scope, talking about having to deal with a countrywide, planet-wide, galaxy-wide war or catastrophe. And while attending school can feel like a catastrophe, I don't think it qualifies as something that can, give the impression of an epic battle. However, Chris, to push back on your idea that comedies cannot be epics, one of the things I took away from our research is that if a story is told over multiple parts, that saga can now qualify as an epic. As it is, take the Lord of the Rings deal. Like, Lord of the Rings has 3 separate movies, which each by itself may qualify as an epic. But when we talk about an epic, when Lord of the Rings, we are talking about the entire trilogy. And so with that in mind, I'm going to ask you from a comedic standpoint, can The Hangover, which has 3 parts, for a combined somewhere in the neighborhood of like 4.5 hours, can that qualify in its entirety as an epic?
Unfortunately, I've only seen the first one, but I feel like they're not connected enough for me to call that an epic.
Yeah, interesting.
I tend to think those were all, and that's kind of the problem is like, they didn't do The Hangover with 3 or 4 movies in mind. They did it. It way outperformed expectations, and so they decided to do 2 more that weren't. I tend to think not related to the original story. So I would count that out.
Yeah. Now, everybody's kind of mentioned time as an element in terms of epics, but one of the things that was part of the stuff that we were reading talked about the fact that, a lot of epics are long, but that's not something that makes a movie an epic. It's just the sheer length of it for starters. So the fact that Ferris Bueller isn't a marathon, I don't think has anything to do with it. I think it's more about, for me, it was more about the moments. But you brought up the fact that sets of movies that are connected, like The Lord of the Rings, could be considered an epic one unto themselves, and then also the entire lot. And there are a bunch of others that kind of fall into that category. Star Wars, you know, individually or together. Alien is another one. Avatar in and of itself. But one that I found intriguing that I put on the list, Kill Bill. Okay, could you say it was an epic? But would you also consider it a comedy in some respect? Because I know there was a lot of violence in the movie, but some of it was kind of things that you might find, you know, a bit humorous.
I like that, actually. Speaking only for myself, yeah, I think I would qualify Kill Bill as one. To Chris's point, compared to The Hangover, it is a two-part story. And combined, it does meet the requisite amount of time for, you know, what most people would consider one. So I could see that as being an epic tale. Interestingly enough, I think it also includes comedy. Yeah, I can answer in that sense. I'll agree with that.
Yeah.
And they could have done that with the 10 Commandments, by the way. Could have been the 5 Commandments and the other 5 Commandments. So we can hold on to some of our...
Chris, it would have been a 2-part story. Tablet 1 and Tablet 2. Just as he
First
came
one could have
down.
just ended with... First one could have ended with Moses just checking his pockets like, shoot, where did I put those other 5? I'll be right back.
And then the last one that kind of falls
struck
into
by
that
lightning.
is The Matrix. The Matrix as a singular and as a group.
Interestingly, know that I think so. I'm glad you mentioned The Matrix as well as the other one. So here's something to keep in mind. The research did call out to be careful about calling something a blockbuster hit an epic and vice versa. And so individually, no. I don't think any of the Matrix movies, for example, are an epic. When you combine the 3 stories, and if you decide to include the Animatrix with that as well, so the 4 complete stories into this, then yes, I would call that an epic. But individually, I don't think any of those Matrix movies counts. And yes, I am purposefully leaving off the most recent one because that was trash.
I think that's part of why. That's another part of why epics are probably we see less of them is because a lot of these franchises become so disjointed. They're measuring how the previous movie did to see if they should do another one. So it's tough to connect the stories because they become these cash grabs. And yes, the point of putting out the movies is to make money, but it's like they're so contingent on how the last movie did. They just kind of, these stories become one unto themselves, and either they're bad or they're just not connected to the others.
I feel largely that you guys are really diluting epic. I really do. I think you guys are watering it down, the meaning of epic, though. I think 10 Commandments certainly struck a chord. Malcolm X, there's the historical span that consisted of context and the delivery of that movie. The Lord of the Rings, I agree. The Godfather, unique world. We can only enter that world through that story. Roots, Game of Thrones, Schindler's List. It touches your soul, these movies. Killers of the Flower Moon. It touches your soul, these movies. Oppenheimer. Okay, 1917. Very few of us know about World War I. Lincoln. I mean, how can you look at that list of movies that reflect the values of a nation, that took the time to build the story and to give us time to care about the characters and had these, huge, unique worlds that we could only enter through that story and that resonated with our values and spoke to grander themes of humanity? How can you look at that list and say that some of the movies you guys mentioned are epic?
You don't think The Matrix reflected values or good and evil or any of those things?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, no one can be told what the Matrix is. You have to see it for yourself.
This is your last chance. After this, there is no turning back. You take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
To be fair, okay, so I will step back on something like The Matrix because I will step back on something like The Matrix because
we know. We know.
Right.
We all know.
I'm not, notice all the movies I mentioned. I am not, these were drama. I don't watch sci-fi. Okay, so Matrix was sci-fi, and so, yeah.
The thing with
That's
the Matrix,
why I step back, and there's a uniqueness about it. It's a unique world, no doubt.
It's a unique world, but also it has a lot to do with values, and anybody that did watch it understands very quickly that it is a parallel story about Jesus. Like, Neo is supposed to represent Jesus. He is literally called the One for that reason. Like, they gave him that grand deal. And a lot of what happens throughout that story is a sci-fi, explanation of the story of Jesus, essentially.
It's really a bastardization of Jesus, because Jesus never would have come in using a gun. I mean, that's what the Israelites expected.
Neither did Neo.
But
Neo didn't use a gun.
Jesus didn't come in with anything like that.
Neo did not use a gun.
That was not how he was going to do it.
But nonetheless,
Neo didn't use a gun after he leveled up. He did before.
Oh, that's true. Before he knew he was the one, he did. He lit up that lobby for sure.
He asked for lots of guns.
What's another movie? Mom, what's another movie you push back on us qualifying as an epic?
What was the movie, the Las Vegas thing? What was that movie you guys mentioned?
Vegas. Talking about
the Hangover. Yeah, I said.
Yeah,
I
Hangover.
Said no
I was asking from a comedic standpoint. Like Chris mentioned, that comedies don't really fall into that, and so I asked if a 3-part story like that could be, like when you combine them, could be considered an epic. And I think Chris
Hangover.
That they're not, as I understand. Yeah,
I think, but I mean, you could. I would. It would take a very, very, very well written script, and I'm not saying The Hangover wasn't well written, but it would take something really well written to make us laugh for really 3 hours, 3.5 hours,
4 hours.
If you're gonna make a comedy that's twice as long as your average comedy, make us laugh throughout it, and then include all these kind of deeper, more profound themes. That's by the end of that, I don't know if I would. I mean, it would have to move away from comedy at some point. It would have to move away from the humor at some point. So I just think it's hard to include all that and then make people laugh for 180 minutes or whatever it is.
And it defeats the purpose of going to see a comedy too.
I would say so, but
yeah.
Okay. Again, though, I think people pick their movies based on who's making them. If you get a director people love or a personality that people really, really enjoy, you might be able to draw them to go see. I believe in this person's talent enough that they can actually pull this thing off that doesn't seem all that conceivable.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'm going to throw something out there that's upcoming. And, we talked about a lot of the stuff being related to historical things or certain time periods. I'm looking forward to the Odyssey coming up.
I am too.
And I wonder if you guys feel like that one would fall into category of epic.
There's no way you can do the Odyssey in under 3 hours. So it already hits the requisite time. It's done with a bit of mythology tied to it, historical context, that kind of whatever. So I'm just saying, like, all of those things hit the easy criterion. The only question we can't answer till it comes out is it good?
Yeah.
It's being marketed as an epic, and I mean, that obviously Christopher Nolan's doing it that's generally his where he lives at,
exactly.
These space of epics. So I think if it ended up being anything less than that, I think people would be disappointed.
The thing for me that I'll take away from our conversation is there are some small markers that a story has to reach in order for it to even possibly qualify, and that is time is going to be a part of it. Time is going to be a part of it. There has to be something grand about the story or about the world that is being built to tell said story. And then I think for me, Chris said something extremely important because it speaks to the saga portion of it, and that is that it has to be a continuous story. It has to properly connect to the previous ones if we're talking about multiple parts. And that's why for me, after bringing up The Hangover, I really liked what he had to say about that. I can't qualify that one, for example, as an epic. Not only because we talked about how comedies can't really get there, but the biggest part that Chris said was they didn't make parts 2 and 3 as a continuation of said story. They were like, oh, cool, we made a bunch of money on 1. Let's make 2. Oh, 2 made some money. Let's make 3. So it's not a 3-part story. It's just, a sequel and then a sequel to the sequel. So I can't view that as an epic story compared to, say, like a Star Wars that is put together. And especially when I would hear it growing up, it wasn't Star Wars, the first movie that was released. People always talked about it in the reverence of the entire story. And so that's the biggest thing I'll take away is time, world building, and continuous grand story.
For me, it has to be thought-provoking and humanity-affirming. I think that those are emotional and psychological aspects that have to be a part of the film. I go ahead and accept that it is going to be a long film, and it's going to be a visual spectacle. I expect that. So that's a given, in my view. These other 2 elements, the psychological and emotional elements, though, are absolutely necessary for me to complete, the definition of epic, in my view, for that film. So I think that's key. Can I add 2 other things here? I think one thing we didn't touch on is the significance of the music score. I'm not necessarily saying we need to go down that rabbit hole, but I think the score is just so key to making these films emotionally resonant. And I don't think there's enough credit given to that. I think, unfortunately, you have to go look at, articles around not music composition, but film scores in order to get, some discussion around that. It's interesting that around epics, you don't get a lot of discussion about the film scores. One other thing I did want to say about them, too, was how the evolution of technology around film, cameras, film gauges, widescreens, and all of that have allowed for epic films to come to be. And I think that is really, that is something that should be recognized. That, without those things, we don't get even the Ben-Hur, which I think came out in was the late 50s, early 60s. And we don't get a lot of the epics we have seen since then, like Killers of the Flower Moon, Oppenheimer. We don't get a lot of these epics that we've had since then. And so, hats off to the innovators, the technology innovators around film.
I say, I agree with that. But I also say hats off to people who experiment too. To people who take on a challenge like that. And I mean, I'll throw out an example. A couple of years ago, there was a film called the Book of Clarence that came out that starred Lakeith Stanfield and R.J. Seiler, and I thought that was attempting to do what we were talking about, which is essentially have a kind of comedy fueled epic in a sense. It had chariot races and it was set in biblical times and stuff like that. And as it goes on, it starts to venture. The tone kind of changes. It gets a little confused and a little muddied. But I remember hearing about the director James Samuel. He was very influenced by movies like Ben-Hur and a lot of Ten Commandments and like some of those older epics. And so I just want to take a moment to acknowledge people who do whether it's successful or not, whether it ends up being considered a classic or an epic or it's critically acclaimed. I think it's cool that when people try new things, I think that's what art's all about.
Yeah. I agree.
Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Everyone is welcome. Except you. But am I not a child of the Lord? you highfalutin nincompoop. You want me to baptize you to attain good favor with our Lord, so that when you are called to heaven, you and this bushman will be welcomed with open arms?
Yes, basically.
So, class, you now believe in Jesus?
Yes, basically.
I'm curious, are there any, so a lot of epics seem to be based off of, stories, books, whatever that we've read. And obviously, they're usually ginormously thick, but is there a thick story? Is there a book or anything that you've come across that you really think would make a good epic on the big screen?
No, I can't think of anything, but I tell you, when I saw the Odyssey being advertised, I jumped all over that, being eager to see that. So stories like that, and to your point, if they reprise some of the stories that they've done in the past, like the Ten Commandments, with today's cinematography and special effects, that might be interesting to see, to see those redone. But stories like the Odyssey, I could see more things like that, because I think, I guess in every age where there's advancement in film technology, you go, ooh, it would be great to see this or that or whatever. But yeah, stories like that, I would like to see more of those come about.
Admittedly, for me, I'm a huge fan of spy novels. So
yeah.
That doesn't fit. It doesn't fit well for epics, I think. I don't think it's, at least not in the way that I define epics. I love the emotional resonance of these films, and I love that the ones that are based in factual history are incredibly valuable to people. I think, for example, about Killers of the Flower Moon, and that is a story that I knew nothing about. And so what I love so much about, having this, I don't know, you can't call it a genre, but having this thing called epic allows for stories like that to be told, to be given the time they need to be told, and to teach us something about the past, our past.
Yeah.
Oh, I was sent down from Washington, D.C. to see about these murders.
See what about them?
See who's doing it.
You a detective? You Pinkerton? What are you?
No, sir, I was a Texas Ranger. I'm now with the federal government. It's called the Bureau of Investigation.
I tell you what, if you got questions, I'll go talk to the sheriff. He can probably tell you what you need to know.
Oh, yes, sir, I have. I talked to him, but I'm here to speak with Molly Burkhart, whose sisters and mother is dead.
Yeah, I can't think of any because I'm not really a huge fan of epics. To be honest, I would rather see a story kind of boiled down to a little bit more contained kind of narrative. But so I can't really think of a whole lot that I would want to see that haven't really been done yet. So yeah, unfortunately I don't have anything coming to mind.
It's a great question, Brandon. It's a great question. What about you?
Yeah.
What about you?
Any for you?
I don't know if there's a story specifically that I would want to watch. So I think, Mom, you brought up spy novels and such, and I like investigative things as well. So I think what I would want to see, and I know that they've done this before, but I'd like to see a spin-off of Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes has a lot of small stories. Well, hold on. I'll explain. Yes, I know there's plenty of Sherlock Holmes movies, but I think I'd like it done differently, where we get more. I want it done from the perspective of the character's progression in life, as opposed to just an investigative story where he's doing this one thing. Maybe the way it's told is take a Sherlock Holmes later on in his career, with some flashback sequences that kind of reference some of the older stories and kind of shows moments that he learned from them or something that highly impacted him along the way as we reach the culmination of his fight with Professor Moriarty. Like maybe it's told in that kind of manner. so we can actually see his struggle as opposed to just trying to figure out who done it.
Sounds like a Sherlock Holmes biopic.
Somewhat. But I mean, I've always felt like the character has to have, like, you number one, you can't be that dang more intelligent than everybody else without some explanation. So what is his story? The closest I've come to knowing his story is watching Elementary, where we found out that he was a cokehead. So, you know, he was a drug addict. That was all, but that's all we knew about his history.
Maybe that's why he was so smart.
Yeah.
It opened him up. He had no inhibitions. No inhibitions.
Well, to your point,
true.
They talk about
if he dropped acid, then you could get an epic out of that.
There you go.
Coke's a little more difficult.
My name is Joan Watson. I've been hired by your father to be your sober companion. He told me he was going to email you about me. I'm here to make the transition from your rehab experience to the routine of your everyday life as smooth as possible. So I will be living with you for the next 6 weeks, which means I'll be available to you 24/7.
Do you believe in love at first sight? I know what you're thinking. The world is a cynical place and I must be a cynical man, thinking a woman like you would fall for a line like that. The thing is, it isn't a line. So please hear me when I say this. I have never loved anyone as I do you right now, in this moment.
Do you believe in love at first sight? I know what you're thinking. The world is a cynical place, and I must be a cynical man thinking a woman like you.
Well, they also talked about his deal, to your point, with Moriarty and also his father. So they gave a little bit of some of the how he got there.
From a cinematic perspective, from a movie perspective, I'd like to see him 2 hour 45, 3 hour long saga story that tells me more about how he even acquired some of these skills.
I think one thing I've learned anyway from our talk today is that what defines an epic is certainly subjective, that it's certainly different for everyone. I think the definition would vary depending upon who you talk to, and I think our lists would be, I won't say they'll be very different. There would certainly be some overlap. But I think ultimately we would wind up getting into debates with our friends about what constitutes an epic and why certain films do and do not fit, which makes for, interesting conversation. Gives us something to think about.
Yep. Thanks so much for listening to the Cup of Tea Critiques podcast. Honestly, we could go on and on like we do at our dinner table, but we appreciate you figuring out your cup of tea along with us. Make sure you rate and follow us wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Also, leave a comment and tell us some of your favorite epics. You can stay in the loop on all things COTC by subscribing on our website at cupofteacritiques.com. You can also find us on Facebook, check out our Instagram at Cup of Tea Critiques, and on Letterboxd at COT Critiques. For Reba, Terry, and Chris, I'm Brandon. We'll see you next time for another deep look with a deep brew.